Universities across the country figuring out how they might bring students back on campus this fall. Some even suggesting that they could still have a football season. But the president of the University of Michigan does not share that optimism entirely, telling the Wall Street Journal he has, quote, some degree of doubt as to whether there will be college athletics anywhere, at least in the fall. University of Michigan President Dr. Mark Schlissel joins me now. He is also an immunologist by training. All right, Doc, let's start with football. My best friend, Michael, went to UMich. We are Wolverines fans in this household, gold blue. Football is such an important part of your university. How do you even start to think about opening up the big house for games?
Oh, gosh, Allison, our student athletes are also students, and our goal is to be able to find a way to bring students back to campus safely. I'm very confident that we'll be able to do that, although we're still working on the details and a final decision's yet to be made. But I can't imagine if you can't bring regular students back to campus for their studies, then you really can't bring student athletes back to campus for their competition. But as I said, I'm cautiously optimistic we'll be able to bring all our students back.
I know that in the major leagues, athletes have unions that can advocate for them. College athletes don't have that. Do you plan on including your student athletes in the decision-making process in any way?
Yeah, the student athletes are important, and all of our students are important. We've reached out to different student groups, asking them their thoughts about coming back to campus for the fall semester and talk to them about what such a semester would look like. Our athletic director and coaches speak to their student athletes all the time. I don't think anybody would be forced to participate in an athletic event if they didn't feel safe doing so. And also, we're part of the Big Ten, and the Big Ten as a group has put together a committee of health representatives from each of the campuses who are working on a back to sports kind of blueprint for us to share.
Let's talk about academics, because you said this. I mean, how can you even think about playing sports or the having a football game at the big house if you're not ready to bring students fully back to campus? Where are you in that decision-making process about potentially bringing students back? And as an immunologist, what are the different health factors you're considering and thinking about as you try to figure out how to bring your students back safely?
Yeah, what's really influenced my decision-making is the realization that we're going to have to learn to live with COVID-19. It's going to be with us for at least this full academic year. It won't go away till we have a vaccine. And even if we have a vaccine at the end of the year or the beginning of the new year, it's going to take quite some time to vaccinate 300 million people times 2 injections. So we're planning for the full year. And what it's going to take is the public health toolbox. It'll take social distancing, masks, the ability to test people for virus to see who's infected. It'll take having larger classes be happening online and smaller group experiences being done in person, labs being done in person, arts instruction being done in person. So it'll have to keep in mind the same concepts that we're being asked to use to keep us safe as regular residents of the state of Michigan.
Then, of course, there's the factor. I mean, University of Michigan is an enormous school, and you have so many students coming from out of state, some coming from areas that are potential hot spots. I just can't even imagine how you think about that entire student body and how you are sure that students coming in are safe, that students coming from places where they still may have high instances of COVID-19. I know it just must be so much to evaluate, to factor. And they would be back, what, in a matter of a couple of months?
Well, if we're able to bring students back, what we would do would ask them to isolate themselves for 2 weeks before they travel back to campus.
Okay.
And as soon as they arrive, we would intend to test them for COVID-19 to see whether they're infected or not, and then get those results back. And then 3 weeks later, probably test them yet again. And that way we could take folks that do have an infection and sequester them from the rest of the community so it doesn't spread. But if the incidence of COVID-19 is still not low by the time September rolls around, we won't be able to bring the students back. This is presuming that we continue on the trajectory that Michigan's been for a number of weeks now of decreasing number of cases, decreasing numbers of deaths, a really good positive result.
Some students are suing their universities now to try to get some of their tuition back, saying that remote learning just isn't the same as being on campus. Are you considering lowering tuition if you can't bring students back on campus and into the classroom next year?
Well, the regents set the tuition for the university, and what I feel committed to do is to provide the very best education possible for University of Michigan students. And what defines very best is the context, but every one of the students that comes here and graduates is going to have a full value University of Michigan degree and a great education that'll give them all the advantages that graduating from college gives to our alumni.
Dr. Schlissel, there have been a number of op-eds predicting that this pandemic will be a reckoning for higher education. How do you think that the coronavirus will change colleges and universities in America for years to come?
I think we're still learning about that. One thing we're learning is that you can do certain aspects of education remotely. You can do it online and you can do it well. And there are other aspects of education where you just can't replace a professor sitting around with a handful of students discussing a challenging topic. But I think being forced to go remote last spring got a lot of our faculty over the threshold of trying new modalities of teaching. And I'm sure that'll continue to influence how they educate students in the years ahead after the pandemic is over.
Dr. Mark Schlissel, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us while you make these difficult decisions for your university. And I will say it one more time for our producers in the back who are from Penn State. Go Blue.
Go Blue. Thanks very much, Allison. Bye-bye.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.